Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Two Friends. This story was told to Lord Halifax by his friend, Mr. Augustus Hare, author of Memorials of a Quiet Life. Mr. Hare claimed to have had it from Lady Blomfield, who in her turn had heard it directly from the man to whom the experience happened, but who did not wish his name to be disclosed. Two boys at a public school were absolutely devoted to each other. They did everything together, and in the manner of boys swore eternal friendship. In order to seal this promise, each made a cut in the other's arm and signed a paper in blood to the effect that whichever of them should die first would appear to his friend at the moment of death. The boys spent all their holidays together, and great was their despair when their school days ended, and young B, who was to be called to the bar, went up to the university, while his friend, who was going into the Indian Army, was sent elsewhere to undergo his military training. Of course, they promised faithfully to write to each other, and indeed began by writing twice a day. But presently twice became once, and once a day became twice a week. After the young soldier had gone to India, the correspondence further languished until it at last ceased altogether. The old friendship died. B became an eminent barrister in London. His friend pursued his Indian career, and for many years they held no communication with each other. On a certain Saturday just before Christmas, B, who had been overworking and felt that he wanted a little country air, resolved to run down to Virginia Water for the Sunday. On arrival there, he put up at the Wheat Sheaf, and after dinner sat over the fire in the entrance hall smoking his pipe. As he sat, a curious uneasiness came over him. He felt restless. Then he fancied he saw a face looking in at the window, and what vaguely troubled him was that he seemed to know the face, yet could not put a name to its owner. At length, on the pretence of relighting his pipe at the gas bracket, he got up and walked slowly past the window. Undoubtedly, there was someone there. Undoubtedly, too, the face was familiar. But who was it? He could not remember, and, a good deal disturbed, he went past the window a second time. Then the truth flashed upon him. It was not the face of the boy he had known at school, but was, as it were, the development of that face into that of the man he would probably have become. A little uncertain whether what he had seen was real or not, he sent for the landlord of the Wheat Sheaf and told him, "There's a man looking in at the window." The landlord went to see, but came back shaking his head. "Oh no, sir, there's no one there. The yard gate is locked at 10 o'clock, and nobody can get in at this time of night." B, however, was not satisfied. He was sure that he had seen something, though of what it was he was not sure. At any rate, he could not leave the puzzle unsolved. "I must go," he told the landlord, "and get a breath of fresh air." "Better not, sir," replied the man. "There's an east wind blowing fit to cut you to pieces." "I can't help that," said B. "I'm stifling. Go out I must." The Wheatsheaf Inn lies close to the edge of Virginia Water, and as B stood at the door of the inn, he looked out into what seemed to be impenetrable darkness. Gradually, however, as he gazed, the darkness appeared to concentrate and gather itself together until it was focused upon one spot, as it were the mouth of a tunnel, and out of this tunnel came a lighted train. The picture grew clearer, and in one of the middle carriages B saw two men, apparently engaged in a deadly conflict, one forcing the other back towards the door of the carriage. All at once the door fell open, and the man underneath the other fell out, face upward, at B's feet. It was the face he had seen a few minutes before looking in at the window of the inn, the face of the man into whom the friend of his boyhood had grown. Then, in a moment, train and tunnel and face all vanished, and B was alone in the darkness. With a cry of horror, he staggered back into the hall of the inn. "I am ill," he cried to the landlord. "I don't know what is the matter, but I have been seeing visions, terrible sights. I must get home at once. I cannot be laid up here. I must go back to London this very night." Fortunately, there was a last train which he could catch, and so he got to his London house, went to bed tired, but slept soundly, and awoke next morning completely recovered. His vision of the previous night ceased to trouble him. The change of air, he thought, had after all done him good, and some interesting work was awaiting him, so that he was kept occupied most of the day. Going for a late stroll in the afternoon, he was in Piccadilly when he saw on the other side of the street the brother of his former school friend, a man with whom he had a slight acquaintance. This encounter brought back to him with a sense of shock his vision of the night before, and he hurriedly crossed the road and greeted the man. "What news have you had of Willie?" he asked. The other looked very grave and sad. "Bad," he replied, "very bad, I am afraid." "He is dead?" "Yes." "Was he killed?" B asked excitedly. "Thrown out of a railway carriage?" "Yes, he was," said the brother, profoundly astonished. "But how on earth have you heard? We only got the telegram this morning." Dreams and Portents. The Spanish Knife. The Right Honourable A. Beresford Hope, who told Lord Halifax this story, was a well-known member of Parliament and Anglo-Catholic. The Lord Waterford referred to was probably the third Marquess. A footnote adds that the story is referred to in the record of the Limerick jury. Lord Waterford, his gamekeeper, and the man who kept a local inn were one day in church at Curragmore. The gamekeeper reported that a man had been found murdered in the mountains. "It must be the little one," the innkeeper at once and unaccountably exclaimed. He went on to explain his remark by telling the other two of a dream he had lately had. In it 2 men, one big and one little, had come to his inn, and he had seen the big man kill the little man by stabbing him with a knife of a kind he had never seen before. The morning the innkeeper had told his dream to his wife, and in the course of the day, sure enough, 2 men, one big and the other little, had arrived at his house. So vivid was the impression of his dream that he refused to admit the men, but later his wife, unwilling to lose their custom, had let them in by the back door. Some little afterwards, when he was taking some refreshments into the room in which the men were seated, he had noticed lying on the table a knife of peculiar and outlandish shape, such as he had seen in his dream. Presently the men had paid their bill and taken their departure. The body of the man who had been found murdered in the mountains was brought in. It was, as the innkeeper had surmised, the smaller of his 2 visitors, and he had been stabbed to death. A description of the murderer was published and circulated round the country, a strict watch being set in particular on the bridge at Carrick, which was the most likely point at which the wanted man would try to cross the river Shannon, and there he was eventually caught and arrested. An investigation had transpired that he and his companion had been employed in the cod fisheries off Newfoundland, and his possession was a Spanish knife. It was of a very peculiar make, such as was quite unknown in Ireland, and there was no doubt whatever that it had caused the wound in the body of the murdered man. Turn to the right. A man once had a vivid dream in which he was traveling in a wild and unfrequented part of the Black Forest. 2 ruffians suddenly emerged from the trees and attacked him. He fled for his life, and they pursued him. After a while he came to a point where the road forked, and while he was desperately wondering which of the 2 arms was the more likely to bring him to safety, and the robbers were coming up behind him, he heard a voice close to his ear which told him, "Turn to the right." He did as he was told, and quite soon he came to a lonely house which turned out to be an inn, where he was taken in and was safe from pursuit. 20 years passed, and he had almost forgotten his dream, when he chanced to be traveling in Germany and passing through the Black Forest. Just as had happened in the dream, 2 robbers sprang out at him and attacked him, and again, as in the dream, he came in his flight to a fork in the road. He could hear the robbers in hot pursuit, and was undecided which of the 2 tracks to choose, when in a flash his dream came back to him. He turned to the right and soon found safety at the end. President Lincoln's Dream. The story of President Lincoln's dream on the night preceding his murder is well known. Gideon Welles, one of the members of his cabinet, has left on record his recollection of what the president told his colleagues. He, Lincoln, said it was, in my department, that it related to the water, that he seemed to be in a singular and indescribable vessel, but always the same, and that he was moving with great rapidity towards a dark and indefinite shore, that he had had this singular dream preceding the firing of Sumter, the battles of Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, Stone River, Vicksburg, Wilmington, etc. Victory did not always follow his dream, and the events and results were important. The version in the Ghost Book is more detailed and dramatic. How Lord Halifax obtained it he does not divulge. Several years ago, Mr. Charles Dickens, as we know, went on a tour to America. Among other places, he visited Washington, where he called upon his friend the late Mr. Charles Sumner, the well-known senator, who was present at Lincoln's deathbed. After talking of various matters, Mr. Sumner said to Dickens, "I hope that you have seen everybody and everything that you wanted to see, that there is no wish unfulfilled." "Well," replied Dickens, "there is one person whose acquaintance I greatly wish to make, and that is Mr. Stanton." "Oh, that is very easily managed," Sumner assured him. "Mr. Stanton is a great friend of mine. Come and meet him there." So it was arranged, and much conversation passed. Towards midnight, before the three men separated, Stanton turned to Sumner and said, "I should like to tell Mr. Dickens that story about the President." "Well," said Sumner, "the time is very suitable." Stanton proceeded as follows. "During the war, as you know, I was in charge of all the troops in Columbia, and as you may imagine, I had my hands pretty full. One day there was a council ordered for 2 o'clock, but I was pressed with business and could not get there till 20 minutes past. When I entered, most of my colleagues were looking rather grave, but I thought nothing of that, nor of the words that fell from the President as I entered. 'But, gentlemen, this is not business. Here is Mr. Stanton.' Business proceeded, and various matters were discussed and settled. When the council broke up, I walked away, arm in arm, with the Attorney General, saying to him as we left, 'Well, we have really done some work today.' The President applied himself to business instead of flitting about from one chair to another talking to this and that man." "Ah," said the Attorney General, "but you were not here at the beginning. You do not know what passed." "What did pass?" I asked. "When we entered the council chamber today," resumed the Attorney General, "we found the President seated at the top of the table with his face buried between his hands. Presently he raised his head, and we saw that he looked grave and worn. He said, 'Gentlemen, before long you will have important news.' We all inquired, 'What, sir? Have you had bad news? Is it anything serious?' He replied, 'I have heard nothing. I have had no bad news, but you will hear tomorrow.' We again pressed him to tell us what had happened, and at last he said, 'I have had a dream. I have dreamt that dream 3 times. Once before the battle of Bull Run, once on another occasion, and again last night. I am in a boat alone, on a boundless ocean. I have no oars, no rudder. I am helpless. I drift, I drift, I drift.' 5 hours afterwards, the President was assassinated." John Arthington's Escape. This story was sent to Lord Halifax by Mrs. Ford of Carnforth. The following is the stories I remember being told to me by my mother-in-law, Mrs. Ford. Among the many family stories which my grandmother Whitelock used to tell, I more than once heard her relate how the life of her uncle John Arthington was saved by a dream. He had to take a journey to some place which he had never visited, and by a road unknown to him. As he rode along on horseback, it struck him that, though the day was familiar, a thing which puzzled him considerably. At last he came in sight of a ferry house, at the door which stood a man looking out for passengers. Instantly it flashed across John Arthington's mind that a few nights before he had dreamed the whole scene, and that in his dream he had got into the ferry boat, that it had sunk, and that he had been drowned. He was so strongly impressed by this memory that he asked the owner of the boat if there was no other way of crossing the bridge. The man replied that there was a bridge 2 miles further up, but people generally preferred to cross by the boat. John Arthington, however, said he would ride forward to the bridge, and did so. On his return journey, which he also made by way of the bridge, the man at the ferry house stopped him to say that it was very fortunate for him that he had chosen the bridge, for when the boat reached the middle of the river it had turned over and all on board had been drowned. two submarines. The following story, though written in the third person, was apparently sent to Lord Halifax by Ruth, Countess of Chichester. During the war, an old nurse who came down from Scotland to visit Lady Chichester told her that one night recently she had had a dream about the fourth bridge, and that in the dream she had seen what she described as whales, with castles on their backs circling around the third pillar of the bridge. On the following night exactly the same dream had occurred again. So impressed was she by the dream and its recurrence that she wrote to her nephew, who was employed at the time in work on the bridge, told him of her experience, and asked him if he thought it had any meaning. In due course the nephew replied, "What you saw," he wrote, "is not whales with castles on their backs, but submarines with their periscopes showing above the water." He told her that at the time when her letter arrived, they were engaged in protecting the bridge against submarine attack by surrounding the pillars with concrete against which the shock of a torpedo would spend itself. Every pillar had been so protected except the third pillar, work on which was only half completed. The nephew had accordingly shown his aunt's letter to his foreman, a shrewd old Scot, who was sure that something was intended by it, remarking at once, "We had better take measures to make sure everything is safe." Some of the men were kept back, and by working day and night, finishing concreting the third pillar. At the same time a hint of some sort was passed to the naval authorities that submarine attacks were to be expected. On the day after the bridge was made safe, two German submarines actually appeared in the fourth and attacked the bridge. They were unable to do any damage, and one of them was eventually taken. The Fighting Rooks and the Black Mouse. The following stories were sent to Lord Halifax in 1880 by his uncle, the Reverend the Honourable Francis R. Grey, son of Lord Grey of the Reform Bill and for many years rector of Morpeth. A former curate of mine, F. Howson, is spending this week with us. Last year he was one of the curates at All Saints, Margaret Street, and is now with Chadwick's at St. Michael's, Wakefield. Yesterday he told us two stories for the truth of which he vouches. Some time ago, before there was telegraphic communication with India, a lady was sitting one spring day in her garden in the Isle of Wight when she saw a duel in the air between two rooks, one of which fell bleeding at her feet, so that her white gown was sprinkled with blood. She got up in great alarm, declaring that she was certain she would shortly hear bad news of her only son, who was in India. She forthwith retired to her room, where she wrote on the window shutter the date, day, and hour of her experience. The days passed, the poor woman awaiting in great anxiety the arrival of the Indian mail. When at last it came, it brought her a letter announcing that her son had been killed in a duel. When dates and times were compared, it was found that he had met his death on the very day and at the very hour when his mother had witnessed the duel between the rooks. The other stories of a clergyman attending the deathbed of a man who had led a very evil life. In company with the wife of the dying man, the clergyman was watching by the bed when a jet black mouse crept onto the counterpane. They tried to frighten it away, but there it remained. They tried to catch it, but it always evaded them. In spite of all they could do, the mouse stayed on the counterpane until the man died, when it disappeared as suddenly as it had come. The dead man left behind him a son whose life was as wicked as his father's had been. When, some years after his father's death, the young man too was dying, it happened that the same clergyman was watching by the bed with the mother. Once more the black mouse appeared, could not be dislodged, stayed until the young man was dead, and then disappeared. I think Howson told me he had this story from the clergyman who was at both deathbeds. Lord Dursey's Ring. The Right Honourable A. Beresford Hope told Lord Halifax this story on the occasion of the latter's visit to him at Bedgebury in December 1874. Mr. Beresford Hope had the tale from his uncle, Lord Decies. Some years ago, while travelling on the continent, Lord Decies had come across a Mr. Lionel Ashley, son of the 6th Earl of Shaftesbury. Mr. Ashley appeared to be very much out at elbows, but was wearing a peculiar ring with a skull and crossbones engraved upon it. On Lord Decies Showing some curiosity about the ring, Mr. Ashley told him that it had been given to him by a celebrated French mesmerist and conjurer. The same man had given a similar ring to 2 or 3 other men, predicting in each case that the man would die before he was 25. All the other men to whom rings had been given had duly died in accordance with the prediction. Ashley alone remained, but he was only 22 at the time. Having told his story, he presented Lord Dacey's with the ring, and during the next few weeks the two men met constantly. Some little while later, Lord Dacey's was sitting in his room. Mr. Beresford Hope did not say where, when Ashley appeared. Lord Dacey's would never disclose what actually passed between him and his visitor, but presently rang the bell. He was alone in the room when the servant arrived, and he asked him if he had let Mr. Ashley in. Mr. Ashley, my lord, replied the servant. Mr. Ashley died yesterday. The young man was 23 at his death. Lord Dicey's always wore the ring he had been given by Ashley, and told his nephew the story of it more than once. The death of Lord Hastings. A note explains that Aunt Maria sent me Miss Copley's account of Lord Hastings' ghost story. Aunt Maria was the wife of Henry III Earl Grey. The Lord Hastings of the story was the fourth and last Marquess of Hastings, the notorious gambler who lost £120,000 over Hermit's Derby. He died the following year overwhelmed with debts. Hermit was a famous racehorse. It appears that Lord Hastings, before starting in his yacht for Norway, was entertaining at Donington a party of men, of whom Colonel Gordon, son of Lady Frances, was one. After dinner one evening, Lord Hastings suddenly got up from the table and rang the bell. When the servant came, he said, "Go and find out who has called at this time of night. I heard a carriage drive up to the door." After some time had elapsed, the servant returned and reported that there must have been a mistake, as no one had called and there was no trace of wheels on the drive outside. Lord Hastings was apparently satisfied, but a few minutes later he jumped up again and rang the bell. "I have heard another carriage drive up," he told the servant on arrival. "Go and find out what it means and who it is." This time the servant was absent for still longer. When he returned, he said, "My lord, I have been round to the stables and everywhere. There is no sign of any carriage, and no one has called." Whereupon Lord Hastings threw up his hands and exclaimed, "Then I am a dead man before the end of the year." His companions at the table thought his conduct very strange, some of them supposing that their host must have drunk too much. Noticing their surprise, Lord Hastings explained his conduct. There was, he told them, a tradition that when the head of the Hastings family, sitting at his table, twice heard a non-existent carriage drive up to the front door of the house, he would die before the end of the year. Next day, Colonel Gordon wrote to his mother. At the end of his letter, he asked, "By the by, is there any legend attached to the Hastings family?" He was careful to give no indication that he was referring to any particular incident that had happened. Lady Frances replied by return of post, "You ask about a legend in the Hastings family. Surely you must have heard that when the head of the house, sitting at his own table, twice hears a carriage drive up to the door, and no carriage is there, he will die before the end of the year." "I have told the story," added Miss Copley, "as I heard it from C. Waldron. Only I am not sure whether the carriage was to be heard by the head of the house only, or if the other guests, without knowing the story, also shared the delusion. If they heard nothing, it is possible that Lord Hastings was drunk, or if sober, was suffering from a bad conscience. When I told the story the other day, someone who was present and already knew about it added the information that Lord Hastings had taken a bet about his death. With whom? I asked. With a friend, that he would not be dead, and he cannot lose. If he lives, he wins, and if he dies, he can't pay, nor need his successor, since debts of honor are not transferable. I can believe anything of him. The legend certainly exists. The scene in the dining room at Donington certainly occurred. There are still 4.5 months before the 1st of January, 1869. Lord Hastings died on November 10, 1868. The Rustling Lady of Lincoln and Other Stories. Miss Nash, a lady in India, sent the following stories to the present Lord Halifax. My grandfathers each had a prophetic dream. My father's father, Dr. Nash, one of those whom Dean Church in his book on the Oxford movement calls the precursors of that revival, had been in Scotland and intended to start on his return journey by coach on the following day. During the night he dreamed that the coach capsized and that all the outside passengers, of whom he meant to be one, were killed. So vivid was the dream that he put off the journey. The coach was wrecked and all the outside passengers were killed. My mother's father, after leaving school, was offered by the father of a schoolfellow a clerkship in the linen hall in Dublin. He accepted it to the indignation of his own father, who probably wanted him to sit down and bemoan the folly of his grandfather in running through his property and leaving his family a paltry £200 a year on which to live. One night, my grandfather dreamed that he was sent to the bank for money, a duty which, as he was a junior clerk, he had never been given before, and that while he was there a man came in and presented a check, the signature on which he knew in his dream to be forged. He whispered his information to the cashier. The man was detained and the forgery was discovered. Next day all happened as in the dream. The young clerk was sent to the bank. The man came in with a check, and he presented it to the cashier next to my grandfather. Almost involuntarily, the latter whispered the information that the signature had been forged, and so it turned out to have been, my grandfather gaining much kudos. But he used to say that he would never forget the terror which swept over him when he realized that, on the flimsy evidence of a dream, he had brought a serious charge against a complete stranger. My father was for 10 years in Western Australia, where at one time he was looking after his brother's station up country. Mr. X, a settler in the district, who had been doing well, often spoke of going home for a holiday, so that no one was surprised when another friend, riding over to see X, was told by the overseer that he had gone for 2 years, leaving him in charge. Shortly afterwards, however, the same friend happened to pass by again, and was greatly astonished to see X sitting on a fence. "Hello, X," he called out, "I thought you had gone home." The other made no reply, but got down from the fence, walked a short distance away, and apparently vanished. The friend, after discussing this experience with some of the neighbors, returned to the place with some native trackers, who examined the place and reported "white man's brains." They then followed the tracks to a spot where X had disappeared and said "dies." A little below the surface of the ground, the body of Mr. X was found. The overseer was arrested, and of course, everyone, including my father and my uncle Richard, went to the trial. At first the man protested his innocence, but when the story of the appearance of X and finding of the body was related, he confessed in open court. He said he thought he would have 2 years in which to feather his nest, and before he need disappear. Both my father and my uncle were present when the murderer confessed, and the above is their account. Canon Charles Gray of Retford and Blythe, Notts, told us that his brother, who was a solicitor to the York chapter, once lived in an old house in the close. They had a small son, and soon after they had moved into their house, the child began to talk of my old gentleman, who visited him in the nursery when no one else was there. At first they thought he was imagining or dreaming, but he was so sure of what he had seen that the father, after getting from the child as well as he could a description of the old man, went to the cathedral library to inquire into the history of the house. He found that it had once been inhabited by the uncle of Lawrence Sterne, and the portrait in the library showed him dressed just as the child had described. At one time we lived in Lincoln. My uncle Perry was at Waddington, 4 miles away on Lincoln Cliff. He married my mother's sister and wrote a student's church history and other books. 4 miles further along the cliff was Harmston, and I remember as a child, when staying at Waddington, going for a walk to Harmston Hall, and thinking what a desolate place it looked. The owner, a crony, I think, of George IV, had fled the country for some unknown reason, and the place was in Chancery. Some years later, when we went to Lincoln, I used to go out once a week to Waddington to study Latin and early English with Uncle Perry. One day he told me that long ago he had been over to Harmston as a witness, I think, when officials opened the room which had been locked by the wicked squire when he fled 30 years before. Nothing much had been done while he lived abroad, and Uncle Perry said the room looked as if the guests had suddenly jumped up from the table. Chairs had been knocked over, glasses were lying on the floor. There were moldy, dusty remains of food, all as if some frightening had happened. The story was that the squire suddenly informed the company that his wife had run away with his best friend, sent them all off, locked up the room, and went abroad the next day. Uncle Perry, however, said it looked more as though something dreadful had caused their flight. However, it may have been neither friend nor wife was ever heard of again. My sister had started a school in Lincoln, and I, being just trained and about to be given the headship of a high school, had to give up everything and join the others in Lincoln. While we were there, two of the boarders, nice girls, daughters of a gentleman farmer living at Harmston, once asked Em and me to come out to tea in the holidays. We went for a long afternoon and found they were living in Harmston Hall, as the farmer was farming the land. The mother told us that the house was haunted, though she had no idea of it when she was there. The first night, just when the clock in the hall struck 11, she heard a loud shriek of terror, and someone rushed down the passage and fell against the door. She thought one of the children had been frightened by a dream in the strange house, and ran to the door and opened it, but there was no one there. Every night as 11 struck, the same thing happened, and she got quite used to it. I think of old stones, asked why did they not raise the hearthstone of that room. It seems they never thought of doing that, and anyhow, it all happened years before. Perhaps the wife and friend of the old squire were murdered and buried under the hearthstone of the locked room. The old squire's son came back and lived and died in a Waddington cottage, regarded as uncanny by people, I believe. Several people tried to live in the hall, but it was never long before they left. One manufacturer made a good many alterations to the house, but his wife went out of her mind, and they departed. At last the old owner died, and the place was sold to a Lincoln iron founder. I do not know how he got on, or if there were any more appearances. My sister had been told that the house she had taken in Lincoln was haunted, but none of us, nor of the servants, knew this till after we had left. It was built in 1107, and the lower part was Roman brickwork, roughly reshaped, a lovely place. My mother turned a small room, entered by 2 steps down, into a bathroom. There was a long corridor leading to the paneled drawing room. A passage ran west, passing one bedroom, and on the other side the bathroom, and ending in a large bedroom with a powdering closet off it. Beyond it was a small room in which I slept, and a flight of stairs went up to the servants' bedroom, and down to the oldest part where Em, my eldest sister, was sleeping. Soon after we had moved in, and the youngest of us said to me, "Alice, I wish you would sit on the bathroom steps and talk to me when I'm there." She and I took our baths that night. We laughed, but I did as she asked. One night in the holidays, I was in the bathroom and everyone else was in bed when I heard someone with rustling skirts run past the bathroom door and into the end bedroom. As soon as I could get out, I went into the room, but no one was there. One of us always stayed with my mother, who was over 70, and one day, when I was at home with her and the others were all out, she sent me to shut the window as it was beginning to rain. My own room was the furthest off, and while I was there, close beside me and quite plainly, I heard a deep sigh. That was not the only occasion on which I heard things, and after we had left the house, and confessed that she had asked me to sit on the bathroom steps and talk before when she was having a bath, because the rustling lady would be about. She said she had seen the lady 3 times, twice going into a bedroom and once into the powdering closet. Once she had chased her into the bedroom thinking it was a new charwoman going the wrong way, but when the lady reached the other door she vanished. My mother and my other sister saw nothing and heard nothing, though the sister lived in the most haunted room. The lady we saw was supposed to be Lady de Lorraine, one of the Scrope family. The drawing room paneling was bordered with the arms of Berkeley and Scrope, and was said to have been passionately devoted to the old house. She was a plucky and vigorous woman, for they say that she threw stones out of the window at Cromwell's soldiers when they came to pull down Lincoln Cathedral.